Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the PICG and CRI Group webinar on effective due diligence for third-party vendor risk management. We're pleased to have Mr. Faisal Anwar with us. Unfortunately, our other speaker, Mr. Zafar Anjum, is a little occupied and would not be able to join. Therefore, please, I'm happy to hand over the session to Mr. Faisal Anwar, who will be speaking to us on the topic, and we'll be starting off with a presentation, and at the end there will be a Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask, and Mr. Anwar would be addressing your questions at the end of the session. Faisal Saab, the floor is yours.
Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It's a pleasure to be at this webinar today, which is being conducted in collaboration with PICG as well as CRI Group. Unfortunately, Mr. Zafar Anjum, who was supposed to join us and give the introduction, he is probably stuck at the airport in Dubai, and unfortunately he won't be able to make it. But I will basically take this opportunity to welcome you all to this exciting and hopefully informative session on third-party risk management, how to do due diligence effectively. So let me start by a bit of engagement here. I would just like to ask you this question. Let's start by this teaser. Can you see this question on your screens? So there are 4 choices to this multiple choice question. So if you could pick up the right answer, the most appropriate answer in your opinion, and then share it with us on the Q&A or the chat window. Okay, so the correct answer to this teaser is D, and I think almost all of you have selected the right answer. Third party would include all the external parties that provide goods and services to an organization. And that would include the vendors, consultant, marketing companies, the companies that provide the business continuity services, for example, and checkbook printing services. So, so it's a vast universe of external parties that would constitute the third parties to your organization. Okay. Okay, so let me start off by the agenda for this session. We've got quite a packed agenda for today. I will try to complete this presentation in about 75 to 80 minutes so that we have some time for questions and answers as well. I'll of course be starting with the definition of a third party. We'll talk about the different types of vendors who could also be known as service providers, and they're all our third parties, as you saw on the screen from the question that I had about it. Then we'll be going through the various types of risks, including the reputational risk that could impact on your, third parties' risk management. We'll be talking about the typical risk areas that specifically affect the third-party relationships. That would take us to a brief discussion on the lines of defense, and then we'll be going to the life cycle, because it is a phase-wise process that has to be pursued in the case of third-party risk management. So we'll be going through that stage-wise or phase-wise life cycle, which starts with the planning phase, and then we'll move on to the due diligence phase. Then we'll be talking about the risk-based approach to due diligence, and I'll tell you why that risk-based approach is essential. And as you know, these days, no discussion is complete without the mention of COVID-19. So we'll see what are the impacts of COVID-19 on the third parties, and what impact do they have on the organization that engages these third parties. Then, sort of associated with the impacts that COVID-19 has brought along with it, we'll be talking about technology and digitization, particularly in the area of third-party risk management. Then, basically, third-party due diligence does involve a lot of elements, a host of elements. And the three most important elements are basically the AML, anti-money laundering dimension, and also the countering of the financing of terrorism, CFT, and the ABC requirements, which stands for anti-bribery and anti-corruption requirements, while we are conducting a third-party due diligence. Then another interesting topic would be about mergers and acquisitions and joint ventures, and we have to see what impact does the third-party risk management have on the mergers and acquisitions and joint ventures. So when you're conducting, let's say, an exercise on the evaluation for a merger or an acquisition or a joint venture, what are the areas that you should be looking into? Then we'll be having a discussion about the legal environment that we have in Pakistan, which affects the third-party risk management services. That will take us to the CDD concepts, which stand for the customer due diligence. And in that also we'll be focusing primarily on the AML, CFT, and the ABC requirements. Then the State Bank of Pakistan in particular, they've got certain guidelines, certain directions about outsourcing. So we will be discussing them as well briefly. Then we've got a couple of interesting case studies, in which you will be able to see what kind of problems or what kind of bottlenecks can even the giant organizations, global organizations, encounter while they have either a third-party, relationship in operation, or when they are looking at a third party for conducting their outsourced operations. Then we will be talking about certain Pakistani legislation as well as certain international legislation on the subject of anti-bribery and anti-corruption, and how do we comply with all these laws. Then there will be another case study towards the end of this session, and then I will be able to share with you a sample checklist for third-party risk management due diligence. So let's start off. Okay. So as we just saw from the teaser, a third party is any individual, any organization as well, which is not in the direct employment of the organization. The organization that is engaging some other party or individual or organization for the provision of services. So that's basically a third party. And another brief definition of the concept of third party is the external parties. And I think there was a question on also on the screen on the Q&A window that I saw, that somebody asked me that are the customers external parties? No, they are not within the domain of external parties. Customers are second parties, they're not third parties. Okay, so all external parties except the customers with whom an organization has business relationships. Okay, let's also try to dissect what else can we see in this, let's say, circle of third parties. And it's a very large circle. It can include your auditors, your external auditors. I mean, not the internal auditors, but the external auditors. It can be your, event management companies, the providers of equipment. They could be companies which provide you data services or business continuity management services. And these services could be provided by organizations either onshore, that is domestically, or offshore, that is overseas as well. So in a nutshell, it is everybody who comes into contact with a bank for the provision of various services and for the provision of various goods as well, tangible goods as well as intangible goods, which are basically the services. Okay. Now let's try to see some inherent risks in the use of third parties. And there is actually a long list of such risks. So we will be discussing a few risks. One of the risks is the strategic risk. Basically, if there is a mismatch between what the organization has in terms of strategy and what you as an engaging organization have in terms of strategy, then that creates a risk. By that, what I mean is that, let's say you are an organization which places a lot of emphasis on the customer service, but then you deal with an organization which does not have customer experience or customer service as one of its important strategies for the reason of existence for that company or that organization, then it's a mismatch. So that creates a strategic risk. Okay, then another important risk is contractual risk. Obviously, when you engage some other organization or individual for the provision of services, it has a service level agreement in most instances. You have certain expectations as the engaging organization. And if those expectations are not delivered by the party, that could be basically a reason for the existence of contractual risk. So that's one example. Or there could be many other examples. For example, the scope of services. Let's say there is a list of 5 services in your contract with the other organization, with your external party, but the external party or the third party, they fulfill only 3 of them or 4 of them. Then that's a contractual risk. Reputational risk, I will basically talk about it at the end of these 2 slides. Then there are certain other risks, like I would like to say the compliance or the legal risk. If the third-party institution does not comply with the laws, the regulations that affect that company or that affect your organization as the engaging organization as well, then it gives rise to a compliance risk. And that can also leave you with a legal risk. because as you know that all the regulations, they are dependent on certain laws. So therefore, you could end up, or your third-party organization could end up with the violation of laws. So that's the risk that you have to carry in a third-party relationship. Information security risk, as you know that information is considered to be an asset by any organization. So if there is any, let's say, damage to those assets, by information security, that's not only the your electronic documents or your electronic information, but it could be your physical information as well. So if your third party or external party is not able to maintain a certain level or the required level of information security, then obviously it means that the data might go into wrong hands and expose you to information security risk. Then continuity of service or the product risk, basically this is about business continuity management. If there is a disruption due to any event, internal event or an external event, and your third party on whom you are dependent for the continuity of services, they can't actually provide you with the services, then obviously that leads to a disruption of services. It could be at either end. But here we are focusing on the continuity of services on the part of the external party on whom you are dependent for your specified services and products. Then the geopolitical risk is another important risk that can basically enter into the equation. There could be certain situations, there could be a war situation, or there could be an economic downturn, or there could be tension, between the relations of two countries, let's say, which would of course not be a war situation, but if you have certain services outsourced to that other country, then obviously there will be some sort of pressure on the continuity of services due to that geopolitical risk. And operational risk, of course, I think a lot of you would be knowing that operational risk is basically the risk that arises or stems out of the processes or the people or the systems. If there is any failure, if there is any, let's say, discontinuation or malfunctioning in the systems, or if there is a breach of processes, or if the people can't handle the operations of a company, then that leads to the operational risk. So you would like to minimize this risk when you deal with an external party as well. Coming back to the reputation risk. Now that, of course, is the risk that puts a dent into your company's image or your brand. And that could actually basically surface because the external party, if that party is not able to meet your institutions, your organization's expectations, then basically a bad word will spread out. And this is the era of social media, so news travel like fire very fast, and then the mainstream media is also quite active about it. Your customers will obviously suffer, and they will raise they can raise a lot of hue and cry if their services are affected. So the reputational risk is also, I would say, is extremely important. In fact, I would say that there is an interplay of all these risks, and all of these risks, they can lead to reputational risk. For example, if there is a compliance risk, if there is a breach with the regulations, then the regulatory authority can impose fines or penalties, and then negative news could come in the media. So that's also going to affect your reputation. Okay, so your customers will also hear about the penalties or other enforcement actions that are taken against your organization, or the organization that you have engaged for the provision of services. That also affects your image, your brand image. And similarly, if there is an operational risk, let's say that the systems of your third party, they can't really support your operations, okay, due to any reason, or let's say they've got an HR issue which affects your continuity of operations, that would also lead to a reputational risk, because you will not be able to meet the expectations of your customers. You will also not be able to meet the expectations of your regulators. So that also leads or builds up into or rolls up into the reputational risk. Okay. There's another area that I would like to mention. You know, sometimes the attitude of the organization is that, okay, fine, there has been a breach of a law, or there has been an operational risk incident, fine, it has affected us, it has affected our operations, and the regulators also get to know about it, because you have to report such incidents, such breach incidents to the regulatory authorities. So they impose, if they impose the, you know, penalties or fines on your organization or take other enforcement actions, then, you know, the organization might say, okay, we are a very profitable organization, we are a financially strong organization, so we will pay this fine and then move on. Okay, that's the case. But I think the penalty is only one dimension of such an incident. I mean, you can only see the tip of the iceberg. The penalty is the tip of the iceberg that you can see on the surface, that everybody can see. But what is going on inside your own organization and what's going on inside the organization which provides you certain products and services may not be fully known to the public. I mean, there is a lot of turmoil. I mean, apart from the reputational damage that you suffer, the regulators would like you to take remedial actions, and these remedial actions can cost a lot, because you might have to resort to sort of improvement of your technology. You have to make it more efficient, you have to make it more, let's say, robust in terms of controls, or you might have to go for an increase in headcount. And that headcount could actually come in your organization or in the organization which you have outsourced your service. But obviously, the costs will ultimately be borne by the engaging organization. And then, you know, the regulators, they also then become more attentive towards your issues, towards your operations. They might send a team that could spend a long time in your organization. They can even ask you to appoint a monitor so that the remedial actions or plans, they can be monitored, you know, for implementation. So, you know, there's so many things going on which would lead to an increase in cost, which can increase in the, let's say, management time, which goes into the remediation of these issues. And as a result of which, you might even lose some of your business partners and clients. Ultimately, that affects your business. Okay. So too, in the context of third parties, risk management then becomes a very crucial function. And like all other risk management functions, the third party risk management function also involves a detailed process whereby you evaluate the risks. And once you have evaluated those risks, then you come up with the strategies for controlling those risks. Okay. So that is basically the third party risk management rationale. Okay, I've got another teaser for you. As you can see the question on your screens. let's say I am the head of production or operations in your organization, and I am working at the highest job grade after the chief executive officer. So what does that mean? I am part of the third line of defense for risk management. So it's either true or it's false. That has to be one of the answers. Okay, so I think most of you have responded with the answer of B, which means that this statement is false. This is untrue. Okay, and I'll talk about the 3 lines of defense model for risk management in a while. Okay. Okay, let's talk about the 3 LOD or the 3 lines of defense model. I have put that model in my presentation because the regulators want to see some semblance of it in your risk management, let's say, oversight or operations. Basically, SECP, in their recent guidelines, they have also mentioned the 3 lines of defense model. And if you look at the State Bank of Pakistan's compliance risk management guidelines, or the circulars that they issued a couple of years ago, they have, or they expect from the banks to have a 3 lines of defense model for the management of their risks. So what does it mean? Okay, as you know that there are risks all over the organization, and obviously they have to be managed by the organization. There have to be certain roles and responsibilities which could be categorized or compartmentalized across the organization. It is often said that risk management, and particularly operational risk management that we just touched upon a while ago, operational risk management is everybody's responsibility. Yes, it is everybody's responsibility, but if you don't basically give some roles and responsibilities or delineate these roles and responsibilities to certain departments or functions, then there could be a bit of chaos there. I mean, you don't want duplication of efforts, but you also don't want the people to pass on the buck to each other. So in such situations, it is, I mean, it makes sense to have, let's say, 3 lines of defense model. Okay, so first line of defense is basically your frontline people as well as the back office people, the business operations people. They are the ones who actually handle the transactions on a day-to-day basis. They are also the ones, I mean, when I refer to the business people, they're also the ones who actually introduce the customers to an organization and are basically the first port of call for their customers. Okay, so all these group of people who are either a part of the first line in the organization, or they are the part of the operations function or departments, they are categorized as the first line of defense. Okay, they touch the transaction basically as soon as it arrives in your organization, whether it is a bank or it's an order to an export company for the export of certain goods. So basically the business people or let's say the export operations people in that manufacturing company, for example, they will be the part of the first line of defense. And then they put that transaction into a sort of operations conveyor belt. Okay. Then the second line of defense would simply be the oversight functions. They're responsible for the monitoring of the risk management across the organization on a frequent basis. Okay. And that would typically include the risk department and the compliance department people. Okay. Then thirdly, in the third line of defense, you've got a category of people, a group of people who are responsible for the independent assurance. Independent basically here means that they are not reportable to the line management of an organization. They don't generally report, except on an administrative basis, to the chief executive officer. They generally report to the board of directors through its audit committee. So that's the third line of defense. So from time to time, in line with their audit programs, plans, they conduct audits or audit reviews on various functions or various processes of an organization. So this is the three lines of defense model. Okay. It is important, the three lines of defense model is important to understand in the context of third-party risk management as well, because again, you have to basically ensure that it's a multidisciplinary effort. Somebody from the business side has to take responsibility for engaging an external party. I mean, that let's say request or demand has to come from normally the business side or the operations side. And then, there are different areas in the organization that work to support that business request. So that's why it has to be viewed in terms of the three lines of defense model. And once, let's say that a third party has been onboarded by your organization, then there are certain oversight functions which have to be carried out. And then at the end of that chain, there is an independent audit function, a quality assurance function that has to be carried out as well. Okay, so everything starts with planning. If you do bad planning, then everything turns out sour. So planning is absolutely important, and I've got a case study as well that we will be discussing in a while, where you will be able to see that inadequate planning or bad planning, it leads to very adverse outcomes for an organization. So planning is absolutely important. And there are a host of elements under what you need to plan for when you want to conduct a due diligence in the context of a third party. Okay, we've talked about the inherent risks. I showed you a couple of slides in which there is a whole spectrum of risks, from operational risk to reputational risk to legal risk, contractual risk, and so on and so forth. So whenever we have to conduct a due diligence in the context of a third party, we have to keep these risks in perspective. We have also talked a bit about the strategic intent, and I actually touched upon the issue of strategic mismatch between your organization and the external party. But what do you have to do internally? I mean, it's not, I mean, engaging a third party or an external party for the provision of certain products and services. It is not a decision that you can just take, just based on your whims. You don't do it on a fly. You have to basically evaluate the various benefits that can come or accrue to your organization as a result of this outsourcing. Cost reductions could be one of the factors or could be one of the drivers. But that should not be the only driver. Okay, you have to, I mean, the cost can be reduced, but if that results in the deterioration of quality of services, then that is not a type of cost reduction that you would like to go for your customers. Then there is another driver that could be at play. Supposing that there is some very specialized or expensive technology that is required by your organization so that you can deliver that product or service to your customers. And you don't want to invest in that expensive technology at this point of time, or into that expertise of using that technology at this point of time. Maybe that is something that you will do down the road, but not now. So there could be a third party which has that technology and which has the expertise of using that technology efficiently as well. So you might take a decision to go for that third party which has that kind of technology. Okay. And then there could be certain legal and compliance considerations which force you to basically outsource that service that you may not be able to offer in-house, but since there could be a regulation which calls for the adoption of certain standards or adherence to certain guidelines on a very time-sensitive basis, then you may want that, okay, fine, okay, at this point of time, I can outsource this service to some external parties. Those could also be the considerations. But generally, all the non-core activities, they could be candidates of your outsourcing to third parties. Okay. Complexity of the arrangement is also a consideration when you are planning for the due diligence for taking on a third party. Okay. And basically, you have to see what kind of volumes will you have that you will be outsourcing to the third party. Does your party have the capacity to handle that volume? And sometimes the third parties, all the contractors, they also subcontract their services to let's say the fourth parties. Now that could also come into the equation. So you have to look into all these complexities or intricacies, okay? Cost benefit analysis, we have talked a bit about it, okay? Obviously, there could be a reduction in your staff, or maybe you will avoid the hiring of additional staff if you are going to outsource a particular service. So that has to enter into your cost benefit analysis. But obviously, it would include your direct contractual cost as opposed to your direct staff costs. So that also, are the factors that have to weigh into the decision for engaging a third party. Then if you are anticipating any merger or an acquisition or a joint venture, then you have to see the impact of that also, because when you are doing a merger or an acquisition, you have to look at various aspects, for example, the cost aspects, for example, the synergies, the customer experience, obviously. So you have to see that impact as well. Then the organizational structures can change. As I said earlier, there could be certain staff which you may have to, let's say, shift to certain other areas of the organization, or you may have to, unfortunately, let them go if their expertise cannot be used in your organization. So that might even lead to certain changes in the organization structures. Okay. Impact on the organization's own and contractual staff, I've touched upon that. Then you have to see whether your third party or external party will have direct interface or interaction with your customers or not, or will it be accessing confidential information of your customers, or will they get involved in the handling of the grievances of the customers? So these are the certain factors which have impact on the customer experience, and they have to be evaluated as well. Complexity of arrangement, I've already talked about. That's a duplicate. Cost benefit analysis also I've already talked about. Then assessment of potential information security implications, including access to the organization's systems and confidential information. Okay, so you have to then ensure that your information security policy or information security guidelines that you have for your own organization, they are not going to be weakened, they are not going to be undermined. So those implications have to be assessed as well. And contingency plans, okay, while you look at the contingency plans, sometimes there could be a situation where you might have to resort or revert to a situation where you bring back that function or activity in-house. In other words, technically, then you insource that function. Some incident might happen or some regulation might change that would prevent you to keep that activity outsourced. Then the laws and the regulations which are applicable to that activity, you have to be absolutely legally above board, and you have to be above board with regard to the regulations as well. And as we just talked about, there could be regulations. For example, State Bank has got certain regulations which impinge upon the information security of an organization. There are very important organization, as you all know, on AML and CFT, anti-money laundering, and the financing of terrorism. And then there could be sanctions, about which we'll be talking about in detail. So all those laws, all those regulations which affect your organization, they have to be seen in the context of the ability of the third party to adhere to them. Then you have to look at your own, let's say, organization's policies and practices, and evaluate the competence of the third party, whether they will be able to, adhere to your corporate policies and procedures, etc. Okay, and when there are any critical activities involved, then the matter of outsourcing, it has to be taken to the board. Okay, so it is such an important issue, it is such an important matter that when the critical activities of the organization are involved, then the board has to approve your business case or your proposal. Now, this is an interesting diagram which shows, why am I showing you this diagram? Because that will show you the robustness or the rigor of this third-party risk management process. It's like a life cycle. It is actually a life cycle which starts with planning, then it moves into due diligence process. Then once the due diligence process has been undertaken, then if the decision is to go for that external party to be onboarded, then there has to be a contract which has to be negotiated with the support of your legal department. And then once that contract actually comes into place, then it has to be executed. And while it is executed, there has to be the monitoring. Somebody has to monitor the terms and conditions, the covenants of that contract. I mean, the contract is of no use unless its terms and conditions are being monitored. Then the final step in this cycle, or the final stage in this cycle, is the termination of the contract. I mean, that might happen in two situations. Either you are not happy or satisfied with the quality of services that are being offered by your third party, or the contract just expires. So if the contract expires, then you've got two options: either to go for a renewal, which then takes you into this life cycle again. It's not that, okay, fine, this third party has provided us good services, so just automatically renew or refresh their contract. That cannot be the attitude. That is not acceptable. It has to go through that cycle again. The robustness of this process is also very clear, that it involves three pillars. As you can see on the sides of this triangle, there is a lot of documentation involved. There's a lot of reporting also involved, back and forth, up and down. There is a lot of reporting involved. Then there is oversight and accountability. I just talked about monitoring, so obviously that goes into the oversight dimension. Accountability, obviously, I mean, your third party has to be accountable for its actions by virtue of the contract that they have made with you. And then please remember that you as an organization are, at the end of the day, accountable for any risks, for any incidents that happen as a result of this third party engagement. At the end of the day, you are responsible for this third party operation. Then independent reviews. I talked about the independent reviews of the audit function. Okay, so once there is an activity or an operation which has been farmed out to some outside organization, then it has to come within the scope of your internal audit department, and your supervisors or the regulatory authority may also want to conduct independent reviews. For example, the State Bank of Pakistan, when they come to inspect a bank, then they will also review the outsourcing arrangements and how those outsourcing arrangements were actually put into place. So that's how important it is. So due diligence, or DD, I mean, this is the part that I'm going to be talking about. I will not be stressing or focusing on the other stages or phases of this life cycle, because the specific topic for today is how to conduct the due diligence. So the other topics might be discussed in some future, let's say, course or a training session. So DD is the investigative process whereby a third party is reviewed to ascertain or evaluate or determine any the potential risks. For example, the kind of risk that we just talked about. Okay, so what are some of the components, let's say, that have to be reviewed when we are initiating a due diligence? The strategies and goals I've obviously talked about a lot. Legal and regulatory compliance. And when we do the legal and regulatory, when we handle the legal and the regulatory compliance aspect in any due diligence, we have to also see whether your third party, whether they have some sort of a compliance program, okay? And when we have a compliance program, then the first thing that we actually see is whether that organization has got all the permits, licenses. For example, in the case of banks, there is a banking license that has to be issued by the State Bank of Pakistan. There are certain further permits and licenses in the case of banks. For example, there might be a license to conduct the operations as a securities dealer and as an authorized dealer of securities. There could be a license for foreign exchange operations. Okay, so basically all these types of licenses which might be applicable to your kind of business, they have to be there. Okay, and then you have to see whether the third party, your external party, what is their compliance status with the regulators? Are they doing okay? Are the regulators fine with the compliance status? Okay. Financial condition, that's extremely important, because financial status or the financial strength of any organization of the third party will basically give you a very good idea about whether the third party is has the financial capacity to handle your services. Of course, you will be paying the costs that will be incurred on that outsourcing operation. But then they are also responsible for maintaining their organization. They have to keep a certain level of fixed costs and so on and so forth. So you have to see their financials. You have to see how they have been growing. Now that's important, because growth can also come at the cost of certain, I would say, the violations to the regulations as well. And that's a topic that I will address later on in my presentation. Then pending litigation, how does it have a connection with the financial condition? Because obviously, if there is a litigation which is against the third-party organization, then it can translate into the payment of damages or the payment of penalties by that organization. So that litigation could very well translate into an expense, into a financial loss. Okay. Then the business experience and the reputation, of course, you have to see for how long they have been in that business, for how long have they been in the market, what does the market actually think of them, do they have actually some experience, at least to the level that you are interested in the handling of that product and service, things like that. And the fee structure and the incentives, are they too expensive? Are they too cheap? I mean, if they're offering the services at very low prices, that could also be an issue, because that would mean that they might have to cut back on their quality of services. So you have to see both sides of it, of the fee structure. Then we have to see the owners, okay, the owners of that third-party organization. I mean, what is their history? What is their track record, and so on and so forth. Then risk management. Fine, you are an organization which has embedded a risk management program across the organization. You might have policies and etc. But the organization at the other side of the fence, are they also that particular about risk management policies, process and implementations, about their internal controls and so on and so forth? Do they also have an internal audit department, so that there is some independent assessment of their risk management activities? Okay. And then, these days there are ISO, the International Standards Organization, ISO, and that applies to various industries, to various activities as well. So it will be good to see if your counterpart organization, they have certain ISO certifications, which means that it's a confirmation of certain industry standards that they are following. So that should give you some comfort level. Information security, apart from the things that I've already talked about, you have to see, why do you have to see? Because they might be accessing your systems. Okay, so you have to see if you are going to give your system screens to them. Do the firewalls work? Is there enough access control at their end as well? And if you as an organization are also going to use their system, or if there is a system at their end through which they will be processing your services or transactions, then you have to be absolutely confident that their systems are also tightly controlled, and they have been tested for, let's say, firewalls, for penetration, for all kinds of vulnerabilities, and they have been stress tested. So with regard to their systems also, you have to be very, very confident. Management of information systems, I mean, again, do they have some sort of MIS that flows across their organization, upward, sideways? Because MIS is absolutely important in the making of decisions, in the evaluating or identification of any issues, and so on and so forth. Resilience, now that basically refers to the capability of the third party to handle incidents such as hacking, such as DDoS. DDoS is the distributed denial of service attacks, which might place pressure on your website or on your system, and so on and so forth. BCP and DR plans, of course, we've touched upon those BCP and DR plans. They are absolutely important in case there are any disruptive incidents. Incident reporting also, I mean, sometimes incidents do happen, in any organization. But the important thing is whether those incidents are being reported and whether those incidents are being managed. Whatever are the issues that are cropping up, there could even be systemic issues, frequent issues. Are they being taken care of within a certain, let's say, time frame or not? That's what you have to see. I thought that it would be good to basically focus on cyber security, because that is one of the top risks that is being faced by the organizations globally. You all are aware of certain cyber security attacks which have taken place all over the world, including in Pakistan, which have cost the organizations their reputations, and in certain cases they have even resulted in operational losses as well. So you have to ensure that your vendor or your service provider, they have a good, let's say, plan with regard to the cyber security. In other words, they should have a cyber security program. Okay, I mean, it should not be an ad hoc basis on which they will be handling their cyber security incidents or breaches. Okay, so that program has to be there, and one of the standards, one of the gold standards or best practices that is being followed by the organizations internationally is basically the NIST system, National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is based out of the US. So they've got a cybersecurity framework which has got basically 5 factors that they take into consideration. Identify the incidents, and there should be ways and means to identify those incidents and to report those incidents. Then there should be enough protective measures in your organization, in the organization of the third party, so that your assets, so that your cyber assets, they are afforded the protection. Then the detection side, obviously, that when there is an issue, then you have to detect it, you have to investigate into it, and then you have to respond to it, obviously. And as I said earlier, within a certain time frame. Depending upon the criticality of the systems, there could be different time frames for different activities. Then you have to recover. Okay, so after you've taken all the measures, then your system should be back up. Incident response procedures, as I said, they have to be there. Then you may want to see whether your vendor or your service provider, it had offered some product or service to somebody else and they had been involved in a cyber security incident which had affected their organization as well. I mean, that could give you some valuable insights, into how they handle those incidents. Okay. Knowing what your employees, contractors, and third parties have access to helps ensure that your information stays safe. You need to have access controls, and they are generally based upon the need to access a system. And those access controls, they are monitored. They're, first of all, reported, and they are monitored by different people across the organization. Not only the information security or the cyber security people, but the managers, they actually make certain decisions with regard to access controls, which may have to be changed depending upon the different incidents. For example, if an employee leaves the organization, then promptly that system access has to be removed. For example, an employee gets transferred from department A to B, then department B might have different requirements in terms of the system access, the need to access. So that also has to be modified as a result of this access control review, and so on and so forth. Destructive forces, I talked about the DDoS attacks. There could be incidents of hacking, there could be incidents of data breaches. So you have to actually see how your vendor, and they should not take those issues lightly. I mean, they should take them as seriously as your organization does, or even better. Okay. Okay, then there has to be a risk-based approach. I mean, I'm sure that you might have become quite overwhelmed to see the kind of things that have to be looked at when you're conducting a due diligence to onboard or to shortlist and onboard a third party, organization. But some of those things, I mean, now I'm talking about the risk-based approach. So when you have to undertake a risk-based approach, you have to see various elements and the extent of risk, the extent of the exposure that your third party or potential third party would have against these risk elements. And these would include things like how much is going to be the size of the contract, how much confidentiality is going to be at stake, the complexity, the strength of their BCP DRP systems. Are they operating in areas or sectors or countries which are unfortunately notorious for their corruption? Okay, is there any ownership or is there any control by politically exposed persons, PEPs or PEPs, things like that? Will they be representing the company? Okay, you might be an organization A and your third party might be an organization B. Will they be acting as your agents in certain situations? Now that obviously means that it is going to be a highly risky activity. Then how much cash are they going to handle? Are they actually going to handle any cash on your behalf? Then on the part of the, let's say the service provider, you have to see whether they are handling any unusual payment demands. Are they coming, will they be coming to you for such payment demands or not? Okay, I mean, I'm basically hinting at the practice of bribery in that organization. So you have to look at that also. Now, risk rating, we have grown up in our careers hearing that if you can't measure something, you can't manage it. So you have to make an effort to sort of quantify as much as possible the risks that you will be undertaking when dealing with the third party. So those risks can be categorized into low, medium, and high. So these are the risk levels, and these risk levels will determine what type of due diligence is required. So the due diligence level is proportionate to the risk level. It is proportionate, directly proportionate to the risk level that you and your third party is going to be exposed to. So the type of due diligence that you will do according to these risk levels is going to be incremental. As you see at the baseline level, you need some basic information which can be obtained by floating a questionnaire to your third party, the third party questionnaire. You can get the financial statements, you can get the background documents. So there's not much that you will be doing in terms of going out and getting those pieces of information. You can get them directly from the company or certain authorities, government authorities, for example. But if you are going to move on to the next level of risk, let's say you ascertain as a result of the scoring that it's going to be a medium risk, exercise, then the due diligence information and the due diligence undertaking also has to move on. It has to move up. Then apart from the baseline information that you will be gathering, you need some more information, some more insights, which could include the third-party background checks of the not only the entity, but the owners, the management, and so on and so forth. You might have to interview the senior management, okay, of that company. So it's the scope actually expands. Then at the third level, which is the high risk level, then you incrementally move on. Then apart from the baseline information and the second tier information, you move on to a third tier of due diligence, according to which you may have to go through an interview cycle beyond the senior management of that company. You might have to actually go and see certain other people who are responsible for a number of functions in that company at the middle management level, at the lower management level even. Then you might have to go to that facility so that you can get a feel of their atmosphere, a feel of their working environment, and are they doing exactly what they are claiming to do or not. Then the review of the documentation or the financial information of the documents also then expands. Then there are certain red flags. There could be many more. There could be like 20 or 30 red flags, but I have listed down only 10. So you should not ignore those flags while you are conducting the due diligence. So I'm not going to go through each and every one of these 10 red flags. But for example, if you find out during your due diligence that there is a lot of adverse media about that company, then that should raise a red flag and you should investigate more about it. If you, during your due diligence, come across a weak anti-bribery and corruption program or ABC program that organization has, or you actually come across certain items of expenditure which mean that the gifts and entertainment expenses have been going up, they have been ballooning. Now that's an indicator, okay, that you must pay attention to. Okay, so these are some of the red flags that you must take into account. Now, as I said, that COVID-19 is the focus of almost all the discussions that take place in professional circles today. So let's touch upon COVID-19 and its impact also. Generally, it has been seen over the last 5 or 6 months or more that there has been some extent of impact on the supply chain as well in different sectors, in different industries. There are four types of entities which you can find in a supply chain, okay? There could be products, obviously, that are part of the supply chain. There are facilities, the factory facilities, the warehousing facilities, the storage capacity and so on. The modes of transportation, the vehicles, air transportation, road transportation, sea transportation, and so on. And then the routes that these modes of transportation take so that the goods can be supplied at the destinations. So there has been one or the other impact on these entities, all of these entities, or maybe one of these entities in terms of their costs, in terms of the speed at which they are delivered, and in terms of volumes that can be handled. Okay, so these are the 2 or 3 types of things that we have to look at in terms of these supply chains. So the supply chains have been disrupted, okay, as a result of this COVID-19 pandemic. Some of the impacts that you all are aware that, globally, the unemployment has gone up. Even in the US, I think it's standing at something like 12, 13% or maybe higher, as reflected by the unemployment claims that are being filed. The production has gone down, as a result of the capacity reduction, because the employees, they can't reach the places of work. And that has also resulted in a decrease in the productivity, because you have fewer human resources available as a result. Bankruptcies are on the rise. Some retail stores, they have been closed down. For example, in the US, we all know that even the giants like let's say J.C. Penney and Brooks Brothers and so on, Neiman Marcus, for example, they have filed for bankruptcies. Then airlines, they have become exposed to this COVID-19 risk. As you all know, flights have been cancelled, and due to the maintenance of social distancing, the airlines, they could not basically book passengers to fill their seating capacities as well. International trade is also down. And then on top of that, on top of the COVID-19 impact, there is also an impact due to the US-China trade war. For instance, look at Huawei. Huawei, as you know, is a technology company which is involved in the manufacture of cell phones. It is going to offer, it has already started offering 5G technology, so on and so forth, but it has lost a lot of markets as a result of the US-China trade war. Limited mobility, we just talked about that, fewer transport options are now available. And then there are border restrictions as well. I mean, countries are not allowing any influx of people into the countries as a result of COVID. Hospitality industry has gone down. The occupancy rates have fallen down. Then even in restaurants, even if they have opened in certain countries or cities, then there are certain protocols, some social distancing protocols they have to be followed. Now, in this environment, what we see is, what we have seen and what we continue to see is that it has increased the potential of fraud. When there is turmoil, when there is a lot of chaos and confusion, then the risk of frauds go up. There is also a higher risk of corruption, higher risk of bribery as well. Logistics risk, we've already talked about. Demand contraction risk, the demand for certain services and products, they have also gone down. Like for catered food, that demand might have seen a downfall as a result of the closure of restaurants or as a result of the capacity downscaling of the restaurants. So the questions that are being asked, and to some extent, there is an effort to address them as well. That how are we going to respond to these supply chain disruptions? How are we going to avoid the cash flow issues? And if there are going to be more frauds and incidents of bribery and corruption, then obviously the regulators, they are not going to spare you. So they are going to, impose penalties on you as an organization. Okay? So how to avoid those penalties? You're already facing a downhill kind of business, and on top of that, if you are slapped with penalties and other enforcement actions, then your goose is cooked. So what has that led to? There were so many initiatives which were, I won't say that they were in full swing, but they were in various stages of progress. Okay, even before the COVID-19 situation, but now those initiatives have been accelerated. Like video conferencing, it's not something new, but now anybody who is somebody in any organization, whether he or she is working from home or he or she is working from office, they are using the video conferencing facilities. Now that has an impact on the due diligence of third parties as well, where you had interviews planned or you had site visits planned, you may have to resort to video conferencing, and in some instances even drones. If you have to inspect some sort of a site or a facility, at least from the exterior, the drone technology can also be used. Okay. Then certain other things are also happening. There is more of a demand for machine learning, even in the third-party risk management area. Okay, then the central repository. For example, in the case of third-party risk management, it makes sense, a lot of sense, to have a central database of all your vendors and third-party suppliers. Okay, so that you can get information about those vendors and suppliers, about various aspects of those vendors and suppliers from that central database. Then workflows, instead of going for paper-based or manual processing, you can have workflows. You can have smart workflows whereby the process moves from screen to screen, which can involve approvals, reviews, inputs, and so on and so forth. Interactive dashboards. We have dashboards in various organizations, but we may need some more dashboards and more creative dashboard to see various activities, what's happening. For example, you need to have some of the information about the aspects or elements of the service level agreement of your vendors, for example. Access control authorities, they should be there on the screen. Automated questionnaires. When you do the risk-based approach, then you have to put in all the questions that you are going to ultimately, on the basis of the risk assessed, you have to ask these questions of the third parties when you are going to initiate a due diligence. So based on those risks, your system should be capable of generating automated questionnaires and the responses. Then the E to procurement systems. And we already have e-procurement systems in various organizations. Now the use has to grow. Virtual data rooms. When you are conducting due diligence, then many of the pieces of information or documents, they are given to you on a hard copy basis or on a manual basis. But you can have a virtual data room whereby the scanned copies or records, based on that information could be made available, or files, electronic files could be made available to you for conducting due diligence through the virtual data rooms. Okay, and then there is a big scope for reports automation, which are connected with the your third party organizations. Now, let's now have a focus on AML, CFT, and ABC requirements, the money laundering and CFT requirements and the anti-bribery, anti-corruption requirements. Just keep that focus in mind, and we have to address them while conducting a third-party due diligence as well. So everything would start, at the top with the code of ethics or the code of conduct of the third party. Look at their code of conduct. Is it informative enough? Is it insightful enough to give you some glimpse of the ethical culture of that organization or not? Do they have an AML CFT compliance program, policies, etc., ABC program, anti-bribery and anti-corruption program? Okay, and what type of ownership structure do they have? Is it a very complicated structure or what? Sometimes the ownership structures are deliberately made very confusing. They are very opaque. They are not very visible. So you have to keep that into account, and you have to unravel such ownership structures when you're trying to understand your third party's structure. UBO is the ultimate beneficial owner. Who gets the ultimate benefit of that entity? It may or may not be the actual owner, and I'll talk about UBOs, the ultimate beneficial owners, in a while. PEPs is the owner or the management or the key persons of that company. Are they PEPs? Then sanctions, I talked about economic sanctions, trade. The sanctions could also be there. Is the company involved in any breach of sanctions? For example, let's say there are sanctions on North Korea. Is that company dealing with North Korea? Adverse media, we've talked about. Jurisdictional risk. Is that company located in a geography, in a country or a region which is known for its weak controls in the area of AML or anti-bribery and corruption? You have to see that. Then the governance structure. How much is the board involved at the top level for the issues, for the material issues at least? Okay. Training and development of the employees of that third party. Okay. Are they being given that kind of training or not? Then the gifts policy, hospitality policy. Are they doing any business which is not allowed by the law? Debarments or blacklisting due to corruption or fraud. I mean, there are certain institutions which would, place an organization or a person even on a blacklist if there are any incidents of corruption while dealing with that institution. For example, World Bank. It maintains a blacklist of all those parties, contractors, consultants, which the World Bank had blacklisted due to such incidents. And then there is a cross-debarment pact or agreement amongst some of these institutions. Like, for example, the World Bank has got a cross-debarment pact with Asian Development Bank as well. So if an organization A involved in a corruption or a fraud was debarred by the World Bank, then Asian Development Bank, on receiving that information, will also debar it or blacklist it. Then what about the extent of interaction with the government official? Of course, we all have to deal with the government official, but certain organizations, they have more, let's say, interaction with the government entities as a result of the nature of their business. So we have to see that. Then conflicts of interest, they have to be seen. Then evidence of good practice compliance. I talked about the ISO certification. So for example, in the area of bribery, okay, there is an ISO certification 37001, which an organization may decide to adopt, okay, but there is a there is a process which that organization has to go through in order to earn that ISO 37000 certification. Then the whistleblowing policies. Now that's important. I think most large organizations, at least in the private sector and also in the government sector now, they have the whistleblowing policy. And I'll talk about the whistleblowing policy and what should be looked into at these whistleblowing policies. But here I would just like to say that the organization should have, the third party organization should have an open culture, an accessible culture, where speaking up is not considered to be a crime, you know. So that has to be there. Then donations, particularly to the charities and non-profit organizations, obviously. So you have to see what is that non-profit organization, I mean, about what are the objectives of that NPO? Are these NPOs, are they banned or what? Okay. Sanctions, when we talk about sanctions, then obviously there has to be a screening system for that. You can't do them manually because there are thousands and thousands of names of entities and individuals that have to be filtered for these sanctions. So there has to be a system existing or placed at that or with that third-party service provider. For adverse media, even, I mean, you can't go and read the newspaper today and ask somebody to note down any news items which are against that third party. So you have to look at certain systems which provide you this information. Okay. Blacklisting I've already talked about. Then some of you might be knowing that every year Transparency International, it comes up with a study of the corruption practices in 180 plus countries. So that's almost the entire globe, almost the entire world. So they come up with the CPI, or Corruption Perception Index. Okay. So that has to be taken into account or taken into consideration when you are evaluating the risk from the point of view of corruption. Then similarly, there is a Basel AML index. Basel is an organization which is in Switzerland, and they every year they conduct a study, global study, in which they take various factors into consideration before arriving at the AML index. Now that AML index is used by a lot of institutions to, I mean, evaluate how much or to what extent that organization is, strong or robust in terms of its legal environment, corruption, in terms of its geography, and so on and so forth. And then proscribed or banned NGOs or NPOs, I talked about it. Legal cases. Now, legal cases is, every organization can, and most organizations do have some legal cases going around, but you have to look into these legal cases, do a bit of deep dive to see how many of these cases pertain to product liability, how many of these cases pertain to frauds or briberies which have been committed by the employees of that organization, the third-party candidate. Then face-to-face interviews, of course, not only with the management or the senior management of that company, but you go outside. You tap some external sources, the industry sources, market sources, chambers of commerce. Then we come to a situation of mergers and acquisitions and joint ventures. So when you are evaluating a third party which can actually be your acquisition target, what are the things that you have to look into in addition to what I've already told you? So one of the things that you have to see is what has been their track record. What have they been historically involved in any corrupt practices? Because if they are, then it might have led to certain other problems in other areas, like the There could have been breaches in the money laundering laws. There could have been frauds as well. It could have a snowball effect. Then liability succession, whoever is going to be the acquirer, if you are going to be the acquirer of that party, then you have to be the successor of their liabilities as well, a liability successor. So if you've not done the due diligence and you become aware of their liabilities in respect of the breaches of those regulations, then you have to assume that liability. If there are any penalties, then they will be yours, not that company's. Okay. Then what else we have? Then again, as I talked about certain illegitimate activities or corruption practices, or if they are doing a business, if your target company is doing a business that is illegal, and you become aware of it, for example, that activity was the major basis of their profitability or business, and that was the reason they had gained a competitive advantage over the other competitors in the market, then you would not like to work with that kind of company, or you would tell them that, okay, you have to stop, you have to discontinue that illegal activity. Now, if that happened, then it would have an impact on the purchase price that you might have calculated for that company. The other important factors in such due diligence exercises in M&As, mergers and acquisitions, is that the timeline, the deadlines are very, very tight. So you have to complete all these activities and exercises within a very tight time frame. One thing that you may want to be very careful about is that if that company has got sales, market share, or some profitability share of the market, which is way above the industry standard or the market standards, and that should be a trigger for you. That should be an indicator. You need a heads up. And then an important point is that, there are policies, programs of the target company, but then you have to see whether they have been implemented or not. You can have very nice policies and programs, but if they have not been implemented in letter and spirit, then what's the use of those policies? And then if there are too many of those adverse issues or negative issues, then you have to say that, okay, I'm not going to go for that acquisition. Then a no-go decision has to be taken. Or you might have to find out or explore options which might allow you to go for that acquisition. But in that case, you have to build in certain indemnities, warranties, or conditions precedent that, okay, if this condition will be satisfied by such and such date, then this acquisition will be finalized, for example. Now, there could be also situations of joint venture where you want to enter into a JV, an agreement with some other company, but there, you will be actually a partner, okay? You will not be acquiring that company, so you will your role or your let's say extent of involvement will be that of a partner. So if you are a majority participant, it would be like, at least in some of the laws, you will be treated as an acquirer, and therefore you will incur you can incur the successor liability in that case. So in JVs, they are obviously more risky, and even as a business partner, even if you are a dominant business partner, you have less extent of control. Now let's look at the environment, the legal environment in Pakistan, and what are the influences on Pakistan as well. Like, for instance, we have an influence because of FATF. Now, as you all know, that we are on the grey list of FATF. We have to take certain measures by, I think, October of this year, so that we can get out of that grey list and come to a white list. But that's not a legal requirement, but you can't ignore that requirement. FATF has got recommendations which are accepted by all the countries in the world. So you can't say that I'm not going to affect these FATF standards, because otherwise the rest of the world will not do any business with you. Then there is Bank for International Settlements. Then there is Wolfsburg Group. Some of you might have heard of Wolfsburg Group. Wolfsburg Group is basically an organization or let's say a club or an association of 13 top global banks like Citi, HSBC, Standard Chartered, and so on. And they come up with working papers, they come up with guidelines and recommendations in various areas like corruption, bribery, fraud, AML, things like that. Then we have our own institutions, which are statutory institutions, and they issue regulations based on certain laws like State Bank of Pakistan, SECP, NAB, and the laws that they actually implement through their regulations. For example, the AML Act, the National Accountability Ordinance, the State Bank regulations, of course, the SECP, is the Securities and Exchange Commission of Pakistan regulation. They also have their regulations on AML and CFT, just like State Bank has. So these have to be taken into consideration. State Bank of Pakistan, it basically supervises and regulates basically the banks, whether they are Islamic banks or microfinance banks or commercial banks, and they also regulate exchange companies or money service businesses. On the other hand, the Securities and Exchange Commission of Pakistan, SECP, they actually regulate the corporate sector other than banks. So they regulate the capital markets, asset management companies, insurance companies, pension schemes, okay, and so on. What is an ultimate beneficial owner? I said that I would explain it. So in relation to any other party or customer, it means the natural person. There is a legal person and there is a natural person, okay? So legal person is could be basically Mr. X in any organization, but the natural person could be somebody else who ultimately owns or controls. I would even add, or who influences that entity or the customer, okay? On whose behalf somebody is doing something, on whose behalf a transaction is being conducted. So that is the real person, that is the natural person who ultimately has an effective control over the entity. It may not be the person who has been shown or whose name has been given on let's say the records of the company. What are shell corporations? Shell corporations, obviously we wouldn't like to do any let's say outsourcing with third parties that are shell corporations, and these are those companies which are actually formed under the laws. I mean, they are not illegal, but they don't actually conduct any business. They are engaged in fictitious transactions, or they have assets that they try to disguise or they try to hide for tax reasons or for some other reasons, okay? In that context, I think everybody is aware of the Panama cases. There were offshore shell companies that had been formed. Those were not illegal companies, but the way they were formed and the fact that they did not have any underlying business, that was the reason they were considered to be let's say doubtful. Okay. Nominee. Who is a nominee? The ultimate beneficiary. And I was saying that Mr. XYZ would be the nominee of the actual person, the natural person who is the ultimate beneficial owner. So if I am the ultimate beneficial owner, I can nominate somebody, and that somebody will be the face to the market, face to the bank, face to the financial institution, that are dealt with by that entity. So normally, I mean, it's not that everything is done illegally until this kind of scheme. It's not that, but in many cases, the nominee is somebody who is the guy who interfaces with the market, and he actually comes into the picture. And if there is some incident, then his name is actually brought into the picture. I mean, he's considered to be the bad guy, so to speak. Okay, teaser 3. One of my bachelor brothers is a captain in the army. Would he be considered a PEP, a politically exposed person on this basis? True or false? This guy is not married and he's a captain in the army. Is he a PEP on this basis? Okay, we've got enough answers to announce. I think everybody has got it right. The answer is false. This guy is not a politically exposed person because he's let's say not a senior ranking officer in the army. He's a junior ranking officer. And I specifically mentioned bachelor because through marital relationship, that person could have gotten married into the family of, let's say, a very influential person. Let's say that person is a politician. Okay, so in that case, he could have been a PEP. So PEP, who is a PEP? A politically exposed person is someone who, through their prominent position or influence, I mean, it is not a sin to be a PEP, but the wrong aspect of this, or the sinful aspect or the criminal aspect, is that these people could take advantage of their influence to get involved in briberies or corruption. They can ask for bribes, or they can ask for favors. So that's what makes the PEPs very highly risky. So a politically exposed person is someone who, through their prominent position or influence, is more susceptible to being involved in bribery or corruption. In addition, any close business associates or family member of such a person will also be deemed as being a risk and will be part of the PEP list. Now, let me tell you or read out the State Bank regulation of PEP, and a similar definition is also followed by SECP. In fact, it's the same definition. Individuals who are entrusted with prominent public functions, either domestically or by a foreign country or in an international organization, for example, heads of state, heads of government, senior politicians. I mean, if somebody is just a political party worker, then he's not necessarily a PEP, but a senior politician, a senior government official, a judge, or the military officials like a general, senior executives of state-owned corporations, departments, or autonomous bodies, like, for instance, the CEO of Pakistan State Oil. This does not intend to cover middle ranking or more junior individuals in the foregoing category. So I think it's quite clear, okay? Sanctions are what? No, sanctions are legal measures. Sanctions are also called weaponization, weaponization of trade, let's say. So that can be achieved through these sanctions. You don't have to fire a single shot to achieve your objectives in the context of a certain country. The US does not have to attack North Korea in order for them to make North Korea abide by let's say, the nuclear stance that US has. Okay, so sanctions are also weapons, but not weapons in the sense of arms and armaments. So these are legal measures. These are taken by countries or legal organizations to persuade a particular government or a group of governments to change their policies by restricting trades, investments, or other commercial activities. So there could be sanctions in the areas of trade, there could be sanctions in the area of travel or tourism, or there could be total embargoes as well. Okay, we are not going to do business with, let's say, North Korea, or we are not going to do business with, let's say, Russia, and so on and so forth. But there could also be sectoral sanction. For example, in the case of, let's say, China, US has imposed certain sanctions on certain sectors of the tech industry, and even targeted sanctions. It's not that all their tech companies are under these sanctions, but certain targeted companies. I talked about Huawei, okay? And then, as I said, there could be international organizations like the United Nations. They can impose sanctions, but obviously those sanctions are agreed to by the members of the UN. I mean, UN Security Council issues those sanctions. Then US Department of Treasury sanctions, OFAC. OFAC stands for Office of Foreign Assets and Control. This is a department of US Treasury. They can also impose sanctions pertaining to the US, EU sanction, UK sanction. So the list of sanctions also keeps on changing. It's a dynamic list. It's a live list. Okay. Various countries could be on that list or they could be out of that list, either partially or completely. China, I have mentioned China in red because that's a country on which sanctions are being imposed, and you might see some more sanctions coming their way. Conflict of interest. What is a conflict of interest? Now, these are all important things in the context of the due diligence for third parties. These are all areas that you have to explore, investigate. That's why I'm basically expanding on some of these concepts. I mean, otherwise, if you don't know the concept, you will just be doing a tick marking or a checklisting kind of exercise, which will be of no use to you. So what is a conflict of interest? That occurs when somebody's personal interests, they come in the way of the organizational interests, okay? So then basically such kind of interest, they would bias the judgment. They might bias the decisions of that official who is in a decision-making capacity, okay? So that's basically a conflict of interest. For example, if you are as a company, as an engaging organization, you are involved in the due diligence of a third party as a vendor, as a service provider, well, you or your CEO might have some relative who could be owning that company. Okay, so that's a conflict of interest. I could be involved in the due diligence team, okay, of my organization, which is doing a due diligence on a company which is owned by let's say my wife. Now that's also an example of conflict of interest. So these are.
Sorry for butting in. It's almost 1 o'clock. How much time would we be taking? Because there's a Q&A also pending.
Yes. There is. Let me ask the participant, do they want me to continue at a fast speed, just breeze through it, or they want some more discussion on it? Because in the latter case, it might take about 30 more minutes. Any more responses? I think most of the people are saying that, okay, no issue with time. Please take your time. Okay, with 30 minutes. There are a couple of people who have said no, they want me to quickly go through the presentation. But most people seem to be saying that, okay, the pace is good going. So I will try to conclude it in about 30 minutes, and then we can open the floor to maybe a couple of questions. Okay. So let me increase my pace. Okay. But let me go through most of these concepts. Thank you very much. Okay. Okay, then we move on to the area of customer due diligence, which I would equate to the vendor with a third party due diligence. And again, the focus will be on AML, CFT, and anti-bribery and corruption. I just wanted to give you an overview of this process. So it actually, this process of customer due diligence, or in this case, the vendor due diligence. I mean, you use a word KYC. I mean, the banks actually mostly use this terminology KYC. There is a KYV also. KYV is know your vendor, okay? So you start the due diligence on your vendor by actually initiating an information gathering exercise. It is just information and documents and records. In other words, it equates to your customer identification program, okay? Then you move into a process, okay? A chain, I mean, it's a chain of processes, okay? You, depending upon the risks, I mean, we went through a number of risk factors, and we said that depending upon the presence and extent of those risks, we will see what is going to be the risk level, medium, high, low. So based on that, and based on the incremental requirement that I showed you in the form of a graph, we will ask for some additional information, which could include ourselves, screening for the PEPs. We will put those names of the owners and the entity, etc., in our screening list. Okay, so what's the source of information? It is systems like WorldCheck, systems like LexisNexis, which are available from the market at a cost, of course. So we'll be doing this screening or filtering. Then to see the geographical risk or the jurisdictional risk, if we are going to outsource to a foreign territory overseas, then we will look at the CPI index, FATF status, and so on. Then we have to look at the adverse media also to gauge the reputational risk, and that obviously has to be done through a system like WorldCheck or LexisNexis again, because they have an adverse media list as well. Then other information like for the products, the channel, the sector, etc. So those also have to be looked into by doing some sort of information evaluation. And also on that basis, what you'll do is you'll arrive at some sort of a risk score, okay? And I have put a question mark against site visits, okay? So sometimes if it is a high risk third party, then site visits may also be essential. These days, site visits, as I said earlier, might not be possible, so we will have to come up with some alternative. So in a risk-based approach, which goes like this, through some chain of processes, some sort of a report is generated, okay, based on the customer due diligence or the enhanced due diligence. CDD is generally a term that is used for, let's say, low risk customers. EDD is for primarily the high risk customers. So all that it says is that you have to increase the scope of your due diligence. Then on that basis, you'll make a go or no go decision that, okay, are we going to go back to this party, and are we going to communicate a go or no go decision, or what? Okay, this is the next teaser that we have on your screens. Due diligence on a third party for outsourcing is to be conducted when A, the third party is being evaluated for shortlisting or selection by the organization, but for provision of services for the first time. B, the outsourcing contract is up for renewal. C, there have been adverse news about the owner of the third party and the outsourcing contract has not yet expired. D is any or all of the above events take place. So that's when you do the due diligence. So which of these answers is correct, in your opinion? Okay, let me open my chat window. Most of the people have given the answer as D. Yes, absolutely, you're right. Congratulations. D is the answer. So at the occurrence of any of these events, you will initiate a due diligence, okay? Good. Then there are certain State Bank of Pakistan guidelines on outsourcing. Now, I know all of you may not be bankers. You may have come from different industries. But the idea is that, these guidelines, they actually come from the best practices across different sectors or industries all over the world. So it will be good if even if you're not a banking organization, or even if you're not a financial organization, you can go ahead and follow these practices, okay? Particularly if your regulator, let's say, have not given these guidelines. For example, if SECP have not given you any rules-based, let's say, guidelines or directions on outsourcing, you can go ahead and come up with your own guidelines, or adopt these State Bank guidelines as your outsourcing guidelines. So let's have a very quick look. So a couple of things that you have to keep in mind is that the State Bank of Pakistan approval is actually required for all overseas outsourcing arrangements, okay? All other arrangements can be done in-house. Some of them have to be done at the board level for the critical or very material activities. But if you're doing a group outsourcing, which means that you are basically an entity or a branch here in Pakistan, and your head office, let's say in London, they have asked you to outsource, let's say, your information security operations to London, then it's okay. I mean, you can basically go ahead and do it through your head office, okay? Then State Bank of Pakistan has given, I mean, that's also an important aspect to remember, that they have given a list of activities which are restricted or limited for outsourcing. I think almost any of the compliance or KYC function particularly, it cannot be outsourced. Risk management functions can't be outsourced. Audit, except for IT audit, because that's a very specialized kind of audit, it can't be outsourced, okay? Then what else? I mean, if you're going to outsource to an overseas location, you have to take State Bank's prior approval, and State Bank generally will not give an approval if activity is not being regulated by some regulatory authority in the country where it is being outsourced, okay? Then State Bank would always like to have a right of access to the third party's operations, okay? What else can we see there? AML requirements, they must be adhered to. Confidentiality of customer data is important, okay? If you are going to, basically export some of the customer data on a cross-border basis, then either you take the customer's prior consent or you make arrangements so that the data is encrypted or it is anonymized. Okay, that's an important thing, important consideration in terms of the state bank requirements. Then there is another circular or directive by the state bank which is specifically about the financial integrity requirement for third-party service providers, and there are 4 conditions. One, that these parties, these service providers, should not be insolvent. 2, there shouldn't be any court order or decree that has remained unsatisfied, that has not been implemented. Then they have not been compounded with the creditors, and they've not been convicted of any financial crime. Financial crime could be fraud, it could be corruption, okay, or it could be embezzlement and so on. Now let's take this case study about Boeing. I'll basically talk about this case so that you can learn as to what went wrong in the case of Boeing. You know, they know that they've got you all know that there is a Boeing 787 model. It is known as Boeing 787 Dreamliner. So let's see what happened wrong when they undertook this large, extensive project. I mean, I'm going to talk about just the outsourcing risk because that is the topic which is pertinent to today's session. I'm not going to talk about some of the other risks as well that were present, you know, in this case. So, I mean, outsourcing is or was not something new for Boeing. They are and they were pretty much used to outsourcing. But for Boeing 787, they said that they were going to increase the outsourcing, the span or the scope of outsourcing to something like 70% of their activities, okay? And they were quite enthusiastic about the fact that it would give them a cost advantage. And it would also give them an advantage in terms of bringing this plane into the market fastly. So these were the 2 main advantages that they actually thought of reaping these advantages. And they gave a very confident statement. They said that the 787's supply chain was envisioned to keep manufacturing and assembly costs low. So they were pretty confident about it, while spreading the financial risk of development to Boeing's suppliers. So for the development of this plane, you know, most of the activities had been outsourced, and one of the attractions was its low costs. Now there was an aviation expert, Hart Smith, that used to work with Boeing, but he retired, I think, a few years ago. At that time, you know, he had spoken up. He wrote a memo and he said that, you know, this outsourcing plan, it did not cut costs, actually. It showed on paper that it would cut costs and increase profits, but it actually drove those profits or moved those profits to the third-party suppliers, as well as the knowledge. Now that knowledge was very sensitive, that was being transferred to those to those suppliers, you know. So while increasing the cost for the mother company being the Boeing company, okay. So that was his viewpoint, which was not listened to. So he said that, you know, a complete assessment, a threadbare assessment of cost should have been done or should be done. And you have to define the product very much in detail, and you have to be very confident about the cost element here, okay? So what he was actually hinting at was that the planning should be done or should have been done very meticulously, in detail, which was not done. So Boeing did not follow Hart Smith's advice. I mean, he's a PhD actually, and he's now doing consulting, and he also teaches at a university as well. So Boeing actually outsourced the engineering activities and construction activity as well, long before the product was defined. So it was like putting the cart before the horse. Okay, they did that prematurely. So the results were disastrous. Their costs actually ran over. They had losses. The delivery itself, which was one of the objectives of this aggressive outsourcing, the delivery schedule was also pushed back at least 7 times. So the first planes were delivered with a delay of 3 years. So basically, as you can see in this slide, the portion at the bottom of the slide, the 4 red the character, sort of issues were the ones that were wrong, that harmed, that damaged Boeing. Their image was dented, millions of dollars, because then some of their customers who were airlines, they sued them or they imposed penalties as per the terms of their purchase contracts for late delivery. More than $6 billion they were lost in profits. Okay, so these were the impacts. So the lesson that we learn is, before you decide to outsource, please do your planning. Please do your planning in detail and in time. Then we come to case study number 2, which is a case study about Wirecard. I am quite sure that many of you must have heard about the Wirecard scandal. This is the most recent scandal, which actually emerged or surfaced just about a few months ago. I mean, this was going on, this was brewing for some years, and it was investigated by Financial Times. That's a newspaper which comes out of UK. So basically, as this graph shows, I mean, it's basically a graph which shows the fluctuations in the stock price, okay, of this company Wirecard. Wirecard was basically a tech company, and it was involved in the businesses of payments processing, in the business of risk management, in the business of issuing cards, etc. So that company was formed back in 1999, and over the years, it actually grew very fastly. Okay, and it had, I think, a transactional volume of hundreds of billions of dollars at the time of the scandal. And it had grown so strong in terms of its stock price that it had replaced Commerce Bank, which is one of the largest European banks, and certainly in Germany. It actually replaced Commerce Bank in DAX index. But then there was a raid in their Singapore office. They had many subsidiaries and many offices at international locations. I mean, there's a long list of subsidiaries, I mean, if you look at their record. So they had an office in Singapore as well. And why did that happen? Because there was a whistleblower which had reported certain suspicious activities to Financial Times newspaper, FT. So those transactions, those suspicions were conveyed by FT, the newspaper, to the relevant authorities, the police authorities in Singapore. So that's why Singapore authorities, they raided Wirecard's office in Singapore. While all this was happening, SoftBank, and I'm sure that people who are from the technology, fintech sector, if there are any here, they must have heard about this investor in fintech, SoftBank. It's a Japanese company, and they invest with, they have got very high stakes and large stakes in some very risky ventures. So about $1 billion was announced as an injection, as an investment by SoftBank into Wirecard. So that was also something that this company was able to attract. Then as a result of the investigation, they hired KPMG, okay, which is one of the big 4 accountants and auditors. So they said that, okay, we'll get an independent audit done. So when they initiated that independent audit by KPMG actually, they said that they were unable to verify the third-party profits that this company was earning through their business relationships and partnerships all over the world. Then they actually also found out that EY, they were their main auditors all these years, and they had basically given a clean slate or a clean bill of health over all these years. They had not raised any issues, any major issues with their transactions or records. Then when that could not be verified or reconciled, then Wirecard came to the public. They actually disclosed that almost $2 billion, 1.9 billion with a B for boy, that much of cash was missing in their balance sheet. And then, a few months back, I think it was back in probably March or April, just a couple of months back, that their CEO, Wirecard CEO, Marcus Brown, he was arrested. Now, look at the names. Look at the names with that Wirecard was doing business with, okay? In other words, you can say that these companies, they had outsourced some of their activities to Wirecard, and these include big names like Payoneer, Curvecard, startup banks like Atom, money apps like Revolut, and they even had payments business and credit control business of a famous tour operator TUI and KLM, Royal Dutch Airlines. Okay. Then Tencent, I'm sure that you have heard of this company, which is Jack Ma's company, okay? Alibaba's. So Tencent partner for WeChat Pay. Now that was the extent of their market reputation. But then, as we have seen from this case, there were accounting irregularities, inflation of profits. They had many subsidiaries. They worked under a very opaque or a very complex kind of organizational structure. It was a regulatory failure as well, because BaFin, which is the regulator in Germany, they also did not actually notice that something was wrong with this company, Wirecard. So they have also been subjected to heavy criticism by the market as well. Round tripping is a special kind of scheme that they actually, Wirecard company, resorted to. Now you can see what they were trying to do. They were trying to create a smoke screen and inflate their profits. Okay, so Wirecard Germany, for example, they would send dollars to their own subsidiaries, dormant companies, a balance sheet in Hong Kong. Okay, now that dormant subsidiary of Wirecard, they would send that money to the books of an external customer. Now I have, mentioned customer within inverted commas because they were not actually their external customers. There were certain forged agreements, backdated agreements, fake agreements that were signed, and these parties were shown, falsely shown as external customers. Then the money would go to, let's say in this case, Wirecard India. And that might have been a legitimate business, a legal business. So that's how they were inflating their profits and showing to the rest of the world that they were actually a legal business and a very profitable business. So, I mean, my question here would be that what were these companies like Tencent, which was an investor in Wirecard, and Payoneer and Curvecard, they must have missed something in their due diligence, either their financial due diligence or, particularly when they could not sort of trace why that company had become suddenly, not suddenly, but very fastly, it had become very profitable. So that is something that they should have looked at. They should also have done some more due diligence into the complex structure that that company had. So these were failures in due diligence, okay? Now, under many legal frameworks, organizations may indeed be held liable for acts of corruption by their third parties, which mean their agents or consultants, etc., or any individual or entity that has some form of business relationship with the organization. Okay, so if there is an act of corruption which has been done by my consultant, by my agent or supplier, that can land me into, as the engaging party, into trouble. Okay, so much so, I mean, you people might have heard of the Jeffrey Epstein case. He's he is said to have committed suicide while in jail in New York, but he was a very well-known jet set style kind of a billionaire. I think he owned probably close to $1 billion of net worth, and he was friends with a lot of influential the people. Even with Prince Andrew of UK, even with Bill Gates. So he would hobnob with them, be very close and cozy with them. Now, let me tell you that Deutsche Bank investors, they have sued Deutsche Bank for not having been able to correctly handle the relationship that Deutsche Bank had with Epstein. So that's how far-reaching such suspicious relationships could be. Now, anti-bribery and anti-corruption, the point that I want to make in this slide is that apart from the Pakistani laws, there are certain laws elsewhere in the world who have got near worldwide or universal jurisdictions. And in that context, 2 or 3 of them are very important, particularly the UK Bribery Act 2010 and FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of USA. Okay, so these are very far-reaching laws in terms of their territorial, outreach. The laws that we have in Pakistan, as I told you earlier, the AML Act 2010, under which the FMU, or the Financial Monitoring Unit under the Ministry of Finance, has been created. So they deal with the money laundering offenses, and as you particularly the bankers, they must be knowing that one of the predicate offenses or one of the underlying offenses for money laundering is the corruption or the bribery proceeds, okay, which are laundered subsequently, and they become the domain of FMU, FIA, NAB, etc. Okay. So National Accountability Ordinance, that also specifies certain punishments and enforcement actions. And the main point that to see there is, does a public servant, does he have assets beyond the known sources of income, beyond the known means of income, which cannot be properly accounted for? Teaser 5. Let's say that I deal with some American and British companies in Pakistan for the provision of consultancy services on their behalf. However, as a Pakistani national, neither FCPA US, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of US, nor the UK Bribery Act could be applicable to me. So is this true or is this false? Please give your answers in the chat window. Okay, it looks like that most of you have selected B, which means false. Yes, absolutely, that's the correct answer. And the reason for that is that both the UK Bribery Act and US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, as you can see in this grid. They've got extraterritorial application. If you have some connectivity, some nexus, some context with the US or with the UK, then you are in scope, even if you are a Pakistani national, even if you are not a UK national or a US national. And then the important thing about both these acts is the liability towards the third parties. I mean, that is our main topic of discussion today. So the important thing to remember is that, yes, there is liability for actions by persons who are working for or on the instructions of the business. In both these acts, under both these acts, there is a third party liability. Bribery of foreign officials, that is in scope. So if somebody bribes officials in Pakistan in the context of a UK connected business or a US connected business, then it is in scope. UK Bribery Act also considers bribery in the private sector, okay? Whereas the US as such, that does not consider bribery in the foreign sector under this law, okay? Now, just to mention about the French anti-corruption law, suffice to mention that it has been modeled under or after the FCPA of US. I'm sorry, I'm going too fast. And the UK Bribery Act. Okay, so UK Bribery Act is actually considered to be the most stringent act of the law in terms of bribery and corruption. The US law is also very stringent, but UK Act is generally considered to be more stringent in terms of its provisions, its scope, etc. So the French law, it has classified the companies. I mean, this is actually known as SAPIN 2. So under SAPIN 1, I don't think so they had this kind of classification. But then here, in this case, in the case of SAPIN 2, they have categorized the companies into less than 50 employees and with at least 500 employees. Then they have defined whistleblowers more broadly. And that has actually increased the importance of the whistleblowers, and also it has increased the protection which is offered to the whistleblowers, so that no retaliation is done against them, no revenge is taken against the whistleblowers. Then a national regulatory body has also been created. It is an anti-corruption body to detect and prevent corruption, which is known as AFA, Agence Française Anti-Corruption. Okay. Now, how do you manage all these laws? I mean, how do you adhere with all these laws? I mean, you can't just do it on an ad hoc basis, on a free format basis. You must, as an organization and your third party, to whom you're going to outsource your some of your services, they should have an ABC risk management program, okay? ABC RMP, anti-bribery and corruption risk management program. It starts with policies, then it goes on to the risk assessments against certain parameters. Such a policy should also have key risk indicators which should be monitored. And when there are issues, they should be repaired, they should be remediated, okay? Then training and communication, of course, like in any risk management program, is absolutely important because it increases not only the awareness level in general for the employees, but it also gives them the tools to basically adhere to such policies and programs. So training and communication through various modes is important. Then the culture, accountability. Accountability is basically that you incentivize or reward the people for their right acts, but at the same time you also penalize, you punish the staff, your employees, for something that they have done wrong. So that is the type of culture you want to see in your third party. Whistleblowing hotlines, of course, should be there. Employee surveys should also be done. And if the employees are really very candid and honest in their opinions, they would give you the I mean, the such surveys, the responses to such surveys will give you a true picture of the ethical culture in that organization. Then controls and oversight, there should be senior leadership support going all the way to the board. Employees' background checks should also be conducted so that you can see that you have not hired any employees that have been involved previously in any organization in a bribery case, corruption case, or the money laundering, etc. Then whistleblowing, the important thing to remember about whistleblowing or speaking up is that, you know, it should not be used for your personal grievances that, okay, I have not been promoted, I have not been given salary increase, so I'm going to raise my complaint through the WB or the whistleblowing mechanism. It is not, you know, for your personal grievances or complaints. You have to look at any instances or incidents that are about general misconduct, some dishonesty or fraud has been conducted that you became aware of, but you don't see that it is being investigated or reported. If there are any general, you know, health and safety issues, or if there is some illegal activity going on, if there is a breach of some regulation, okay, that you are aware of, but the organization says that, okay, fine, we are okay with that, we are going to continue with this breach, and it is not reported. So you know that you know it can lead the organization to financial losses and also to reputational damage. So if you go to your manager or supervisor and he or she does not pay attention to your let's say complaint or to your incident, so then the next port of call, after you have exhausted all your means, you've gone to your senior managers, etc., but nothing is coming out of this, then whistleblowing through a hotline is the only thing that you can do, and you must do. But in that, you should not be giving any misstatements that, okay, although person X, who is my colleague, is not involved in a fraud, but I'm just going to give his name to settle some scores with him. You can't do that. And if you do that, then there could be some punishments coming your way. Okay. So this is about whistleblowing. Now, what do you do with all this information? What do you do with all this data that you get through your risk management program? Basically, then you assess these risks and you try to create a heat map. And I have shown an example heat map on this screen, which shows the probability of the occurrence of these risks on the x-axis and the impact, the extent of impact or the magnitude of impact of such instances. This is just a hypothetical example of, let's say, some bank, for example. If you look towards the right side, you will see that A is a finance instance, and that's a bribery to tax authorities. Somebody in finance paid a bribe to the tax authorities. So that will be considered a medium risk, okay? That, okay, this is not an ongoing practice. Somebody might do it, or somebody might have done it only once in a blue moon. So you will rate it as a medium sort of probability with a medium sort of magnitude. NPL settlements. NPLs are the non-performing loans in banks. So if you are going to look at the NPL settlements, payoffs, you might actually like to evaluate how much of a risk is there for kickbacks or bribes to the special assets manager in the bank. Somebody's trying to negotiate a settlement, and he or she negotiates it at a lower value based on a certain kickback or a favor that might be received by that bank official. So that's B. So that could be high risk, high probability of occurrence, and high impact. And HR, I mean, for example, hypothetically can take a bribe for hiring officers, so you have to evaluate the probability. And then procurement. I mean, if you know that there have been certain kickbacks or bribes paid to your procurement department by the third parties, suppliers, and so on and so forth, and let's say that it's a rampant practice, then it could be then D, as you can see in this red box. Okay, so this is your kind of heat map from green, yellow, and red. So the red areas are mostly, and if there are any circles in the high areas, then these B and D areas in this particular case are the areas that you should be focusing your attention on, and you have to see whether this is the kind of practice that is followed by your third party. Now let's move on towards the end of the presentation almost. We'll briefly discuss the Airbus case. Now this is also a very recent case, and it is considered to be a case in which the highest penalty ever in the history of bribery and corruption was levied and paid by any party. $4 billion. $4 billion was the amount that Airbus agreed to pay after there was an anti-corruption investigation in which multi-country parties or agencies were involved. American, British, and French authorities, they investigated these allegations over a period of several years. And that involved corruption and bribery, to a number of airlines in different countries and government authorities as well around the world. What they had done was they had created a special marketing organization, or SMO, and they were responsible for the selection and the monitoring of consultants within inverted commas, and ensure that the commercial intermediaries, they were independent from the Airbus customers. That was a separate independent organization which had its separate organizational structure, a separate compliance department also. So while it functioned well in some inappropriate, illegitimate cases, approvals were taken and they were granted, notwithstanding the concerns that were raised by the compliance department of SNO. And what was being done was that consultants were being artificially created, through shell companies or through artificial entities. And Airbus employees, they were disguising the payments. For example, those payments were not directly even related to Airbus. And those payments were being made to these, let's say, customers. They were creating fake contracts, providing the services that were never provided, consultancy services that were never provided. And to make them look real, they even created fake activity reports that, okay, ABC consultant did so-and-so, such and such activities. And they were also using fake non-reimbursable loans as a means of paying business partners. They created loans for their business partners, which were never to be paid back. Then, there were instances like in the gifts and, let's say, entertainment scope. They had even purchased a whole company which was owned by some other airline executive. They even bought luxury real estate and they gave it, or they sold it to a foreign airline executive. Then they also invested, Airbus, they also invested in a mining operation in Africa in which a Taiwanese airline executive had a financial interest. So there are 3 or 4 lessons that have to be learned briefly from this Airbus scandal. There is always that possibility that the consultants and the business partners, they themselves can be used as conduits for illegitimate payments, Then the other lesson is that hospitality and entertainment are the levers that can be used to win favors. For example, for Chinese government officials, they were made to travel to Hawaii just to have a nice time. Whistleblowers should be paid attention to. They should be given serious attention. Because in this case also, I mean, we've already seen that in the case of Wirecard also, there was a whistleblower. In the case of Boeing also, not a whistleblower, but somebody who had spoken up. So in this case also, in the case of Airbus, there was some British whistleblower who gave a tip to somebody, and this triggered an investigation in UK, which led to the let's say, bringing in of the US experts also, because there was a US connectivity as well. And also the French. I mean, Airbus is, as you know, it's a jointly owned company by UK and by France. So the French investigators also got involved. Some of the parts like the Boeing and I think it's Rolls-Royce engines or Pratt engines, they were also coming from other companies. Rolls-Royce is a company in the US. Not the US, I'm sorry, I beg your pardon, they are a company in the UK. Prosecutors are getting more serious to pursue bribery and corruption cases, and they do not hesitate to impose penalties of huge magnitudes, huge amounts. In this case, it was $4 billion. Okay, so they are getting their knives sharpened with each passing day. Now, towards the last leg, I mean, this is just a sample kind of a checklist, and you can also use it if you want to. I mean, it basically gives a list of all the documents, but this is from the perspective of a US company, and you can customize it, tailor it to your own requirements. So this section is about foundational documents, like the ownership documents, for example. The next is about financials. Okay, there are check boxes. Then insurance, you need to have, you need to confirm and verify insurance in different areas, like the fidelity insurance, cyber insurance, things like that. Business interruption insurance of the third party. Then examination and reports. Certain reports and examinations are confidential, but most of them can actually be shared with the engaging organizations. Then I talked about the professional certifications as well. I talked about the ISO certification, and then there are certain other technical certifications. If you are engaging a lawyer, for example, you must actually be sure that he or she is actually registered with the bodies here in Pakistan, for example, the Bar Council. They admit advocates for certain courts, so that has to be their education information. Then the diagrams like the organizational chart, the data flow diagrams, and so on. Then policies and procedures, P&Ps, host of policies, HR policies, IT policies, compliance, AML policies of the third party, complaints management policy, how it is being done. And it would be good to look at how many complaints are there and how are they being handled. So you can download it. This is basically a company known as Venminder. It's a US company, and you can go to this site and download these checklists. Well, I apologize for the longish presentation, but I wanted you to get the best out of it. I apologize to the participants as well as the hosts for continuing on at the request of the participants as well. I would now like to open the floor to maybe a couple of questions and answers. We will, of course, not be able to sign all of them, but if you have some unanswered question, you can get my email, or you can get the email by CRI group, and they can forward those questions to me, and I'll be sure to get back to you in a reasonable period of time.
Yes,
Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Anwar, for your presentation and details I'm sure the participants learned a lot. I'll just ask you a few questions. We'll open up the questions for about 15 minutes, and thereafter, any unanswered questions, we will send you an email and then send the responses to the participants.
Sure.
Okay?
Okay.
Okay.
Okay,
So,
go ahead.
question from Mr. Safta Bhatt. He's asking, would it be advisable to use a third-party consultant to carry out due diligence on other third-party vendors?
Well, I would advise that if you have the resources in your own company, you should do that due diligence yourself. But yes, it is not unheard of to use some external consultants to do that due diligence on the behalf of the engaging company as well. Obviously, the expectations, the scope of work has to be absolutely clear from both the sides. And of course, the liability that comes from the outcome of that due diligence exercise is going to be your organization. Yes, consultant can give a recommendation. You might take it, you might accept it. It's up to you. So to answer your question, yes, you can use an external consultant, although it's not a very good idea.
Okay, the next question is anonymous. It's asking that for the know your customer procedure, if the procedure is done by way of a checklist based on inquiries from the customer, would it achieve the purpose in the case the customer is already involved in fraudulent activity? They would hide the facts either way. Does evidence have to be obtained for each aspect of know your customer? This would result in significant time and effort for every customer. Quite a long question.
Okay, yeah. So if I understand it correctly, what you're saying that you already have a customer, there is an existing customer, right?
It says in the know your customer procedure. So they said, do you have to obtain evidence for all the responses that that customer gives you?
Yeah, of course. I mean, for example, if, let me take a simple example of that of an individual, okay? Now, in your checklist of KYC, in the documentation section, you have identification, because the first part is identification. So you have to get a copy of a CNIC. You have to actually see that CNIC. You have to get it either biometrically verified or through some system. You have to be sure that it is indeed in Nadra's records. Secondly, for example, that individual is a salary earner, is a salaried employee, then obviously the documentation or the confirmation has to be in the form of a letter of employment from the organization, from the employer. For example, if that individual says that he is self-employed, then again, if it is a sole proprietorship, that would be a good way of ascertaining it, or the NTN number could also be a good way of ascertaining it. And even if you move to the corporate business partners or companies, then obviously it's a very detailed list of identification requirements beyond just the ID cards. For example, the memorandum and articles of the company, the certificate of incorporation, the list of directors that should be certified, then the records that you can check from SE, CP. Then the most difficult part could be the UBO person, the ultimate beneficiary, okay, ultimate beneficial owner, the UBO that I talked about. Because, I might, let's say you are in a bank and I might have opened an account with you, or I might have entered into some business relationship with you if you're not a bank. And, there could actually be somebody else. I might only be the front man. I might only be the nominee, okay, or the artificial person in that case. The benefit of that business relationship or the benefit of that account might be going to somebody else. Now, that is something which would be very difficult to explore or to dig, because that's where I can lie as an individual. But in the case of corporates, SECP can come to your help, because they have also issued a circular to the corporates, to the companies, about furnishing this information. It started just about last year, and hopefully this process will also be strengthened, and the register of companies will be updated with this information as well.
Thank you. Mr. Mohammed Naman is asking that in the case of offshore outsourcing, which is happening a lot in UAE where I am based, what do you suggest to go for, captive or non-captive outsourcing?
Well, if you are doing outsourcing with the offshore companies, then the whole nature of the offshore companies is such that they generally they don't have any underlying business. So you have to sort of dig out why this outsourcing is taking place in an offshore company. So for that, you must do the due diligence. You must actually, if you have to talk to some more people or ask for more information, you have to do that. And if somebody says that, no, we have some sort of a business even under this offshore company, then you must ask, okay, then where are your premises? Where is your, let's say, factory? Where are your let's say, manufacturing facilities? So you have to ask for that information and visit that site as well.
Thank you, Mr. Anwar. We are done with the questions. We've got quite a few requests for the slides, and inshallah, we can forward that to the participants.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And yes, quite a few have asked for it. So thank you so much, Mr. Anwar. It was extremely informative, and I'm sure the participants also felt so.
Thank you very
we
much.
Appreciate your.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and I again apologize, Mrs. Afaranjam, due to uncontrollable reasons, he could not join. So I am at the same time thankful for all your patience and your understanding. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you to all the participants. We shall share the presentation after we receive it from Faisal Anwar. And the session will be uploaded on our Facebook and LinkedIn pages after 1 week. And it can be shared from there on wherever you would like to share. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.